I want to welcome all of you this morning. My name is Dowoti Desir. I'm the founder and president of the DDPA Watch Group, which is an international coalition of individuals and organizations who base their principles in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action Plan. We work with the Global South primarily, Afro-descendants, but also with the South Asian community, and I want to welcome all of you for being here and joining us at this roundtable entitled Commemorating Durban Now and Tomorrow, Rebuilding Solidarity in the Global South. This is going to be an informal roundtable. I know a number of you have formal statements to make. So for those of you who have formal written statements, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make those statements. But I also want us to have a conversation about what these past 10 years have meant. The work that has been done, or things that have not been done in our regions, and in some ways, I'm not interested in defending the Durban process, but I think because we're going to be online, we're going to share this with a number of communities, that it is important to speak truth to power and to speak to why we're here, why we've made the effort to be here, why we support this mandate, and what we hope to accomplish during these next few days. But as well as moving forward. There have been a number of, I think, unfortunate events that have taken place that have really demobilized or somehow incapacitated our movement, our ability to move forward. Some of it has been the NGOization of this process, and so people who are not funded are not doing the work that has to get done, the social justice work that needs to get done to change our communities. Some of the issues that we face is not sufficient organization amongst ourselves, or a kind of fragmented alliances. I think some of the issues that we face also have to do with the fact that our governments are not fully supportive of the work that we advocate, the work that the international community, civil society, as well as government, have determined were the best practices, the most effective tools to use in 2001 at the Durban conference, at the World Conference Against Racism. I like to refer to this book as the Orange Bible. It's no, if not all of you, most of you have read it, hopefully a few times. And so you know it's one of the most comprehensive documents that has been drafted in the global community that speaks to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance. So having said that, I want to welcome our participants, Moya Teglu of the African Canadian Legal Clinic, Elizabeth Clay Rom, the International Commission of Dalit Rights, Vinishri Radhakirshna of the International Commission for Dalit Rights as well, Agent DK of the Human Rights Project, the Urban Justice Center, Muriel Fanon France of the France Fanon Foundation, and also is a member of the working group of experts for people of African descent, Almami Condé, excuse me, of the Alliance Noire Citoyen, and Laurent Zeke, who's also with the Alliance Noire Citoyen and Emergence. So, for some bizarre reason, I've noticed we have a little francophone faction over here, and an anglophone here. That's an accident, but the important thing is that we're here in dialogue, and I think, for me, one of the important things that has to happen is, I mean, we all understand that we're part of a larger historical trajectory. The Durban process didn't just happen because, I don't know, 15 years ago some people decided, you know, we've had enough, and we're going to fight against racism and call our governments to action. It came out of a bigger process of civil rights, of liberation, of resistance that has been taking place in our communities for not decades, but for centuries, in fact. One of the things that had happened in the 1950s at the Bandung Conference was the coming together of African descendant and South Asian and Asian groups in general. All of us who had this common history of being suppressed, of being colonized, of being enslaved, otherwise having lost our voices. And the conference in Durban in 2001 allowed us to speak for ourselves and articulate what our narrative is, what our narratives are, and redefine and renegotiate our relationships with each other. Because of the various things that have happened to, again, break down and fragment the work that we've been doing the past decade, even as we've made strides, is, I think, this little, not quite a falling out, but the connective tissue that held the African descendant and the Asian communities together has just lost some of its stickiness, you know. And this is a modest effort, but I hope we can walk out of here today with some concrete steps, some solutions for how we might go back to our communities, to our respective organizations, to figure out how to rebuild and re-solidify the ties that have historically, politically, socially, spiritually, intellectually bound us together. So having said that, again, thank you for being here. Welcome, and the floor is open. Elizabeth or Vanishri, you had a memorandum.
Yes.
Would you like to start with that?
Sure.
Please.
Before I start, I think Elizabeth can give us an introduction about the organization itself.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for organizing today's conversation. Really very, very excited about a chance to be in dialogue with groups that are really continue to be focused on global issues and solutions to racism, discrimination, xenophobia. And as we see it, focused on the issue of caste-based work and descent-based discrimination, which, as many of us know, has not been fully brought under the tent of racism from the Durban process, but we still choose to and want to work in solidarity with brothers and sisters around the world who are fighting the larger issue around racial discrimination. So my name is Elizabeth Clay Roy, and my colleague Vanishri Radhakrishna and I are working at the International Commission for Dalit Rights, which is a recently formed organization. It's an independent international social justice and human rights forum that represents Dalits, Dalit national federations, Dalit diaspora organizations across South Asia in particular, and many of us are based in the United States and working with organizations around the world. We participate in a number of research and projects with international organizations and with our partners in South Asian communities. There are over 200 million Dalits in South Asia who continue to face discrimination in urban and rural communities, and others who suffer from caste-based and descent-based discrimination in other parts of the world as well, other parts of Asia and communities in Africa. We really envision a world in which every individual has liberty, justice, and the economic opportunity to thrive, and full political empowerment. And we, again, will fight in solidarity to protect people who face systematic social inequalities, injustice, and extreme poverty around the world. In anticipation of the United Nations General Assembly's one-day high-level meeting to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the DDPA, we, in partnership with many Dalit national federations, respectfully submit the memorandum on the elimination of racial and caste discrimination, which my colleague will share from.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This memorandum is addressed to the General Assembly, and we are still looking forward for an opportunity to submit it formally to them. But I'm going to go ahead and read it out. This is addressed to the 66th session of General Assembly. It is in commemoration of the Durban Plus 10, Now and Tomorrow, Rebuilding Solidarity in the Global South. It is a memorandum on the elimination of racial and caste discrimination. Now, the member organizations of the International Commission for Dalit Rights expressing appreciation and solidarity to the United Nations General Assembly for holding a one-day high-level meeting to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Actions, reaffirming that victims of racism, racial, caste, or work and descent-based discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance need recognition, justice, and development. We are strongly urging the General Assembly to endorse General Recommendation 29 of the Committee of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, according to which discrimination based on descent includes discrimination against members of communities based on forms of social stratification such as caste and analogous systems of inherited status, which nullify or impair their equal enjoyment of human rights. Now, we acknowledge the DDPA, according to which discrimination against persons of Asian and African descent, indigenous and other forms of descent are condemned. And we recognize that discrimination based on race, caste, descent, national or ethnic origin are major causes of poverty, social political exclusion and conflict. And we hold that such discrimination constitutes serious violations of human rights, liberty and social injustice and are impediments on the path to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Now, desiring to make more effective the struggle against racism, all forms of discrimination, exclusion, injustice, and extreme poverty throughout the world, the International Commission for Dalit Rights is a global forum of national Dalit and pro-Dalit organizations, civil society, independent bodies, and international philanthropists, strongly urge the General Assembly to take this opportunity to review the DDPA and prevail upon state parties to adopt the Caste Freedom Index. It's a comprehensive measurement and de facto empowerment instrument for caste-affected communities. Now, the Caste Freedom Index is based on both quantitative yardstick, such as crime statistics, demographic data, economic data, survey results, as well as qualitative yardsticks such as legal policies and country assessments by international human rights agencies. Now, social scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, business analysts, journalists, and legal professionals have lent their expertise in developing the Caste Freedom Index. In fact, the UNDP resident coordinator, Robert Piper, compared the CFI to Human Development Index and has expressed his support and encouragement for the venture. We are especially concerned with human rights violations in the form of caste discrimination against persons of South Asian descent, and we call upon the United Nations General Assembly to bring its focus on the issue and make suitable recommendations to the concerned states. Bearing in mind the Millennium Development Goals, especially towards alleviation of poverty, we reiterate the need to establish healthy and dignified conditions of living and recognize the need for equal opportunities for all human beings to fulfill their full potential. On the eve of the 10th anniversary of DDPA, we are disheartened to report that untouchability and caste-based discrimination are practiced with impunity even to this day. The manifestation of caste-based discrimination, for instance, in the form of inherited occupations, is demeaning and is reflective of a discriminatory hierarchical social setup. Untouchables, the Dalits, are condemned to take up jobs that carry social stigma, such as scavenging and toilet cleaning. It's thus significant that the international community has taken cognizance of the above appalling social practices and has brought work-based discrimination within the ambit of the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We welcome the final report of the human rights bodies and mechanisms where special rapporteurs Mr. Yozo Yakoto and Ms. Chin Sang-kyung have recognized discrimination based on work and descent, including discrimination based on caste and analogous systems of inherited status condemning them as violations of international human rights principles. They have formulated comprehensive guidelines and recommendations to be adopted by the General Assembly. We wish to bring to the notice of the Assembly that caste or work and descent-based discrimination of nearly 300 million Dalits can also be attributed to a lack of political will to enforce already existing national legislations and a reluctance to adopt international conventions. Examining the following findings on India, Pakistan, and Nepal can be constructive in this regard. In India, for example, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee, in its concluding observations, has noted several important violations. Pertinent among them are: 1, the lack of progress in combating caste-based discrimination in spite of the 1989 Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act. Secondly, prevalence of worst forms of child labor and other exploitative labor conditions in spite of legal prohibitions, including the 1993 Employment of Manual Scavengers and Construction of Dry Latrines Bonded Labor System Abolition Act and the 1986 Child Labor Act. Dalit women and children are victims of trafficking and sexual exploitation. Instead of being protected, they are often prosecuted under the Immoral Traffic in Prevention Act. Despite the adoption of the 86th Amendment to the Constitution of India, which makes a right to education a fundamental right, there is a widespread disparity in enrollment and dropout rates in primary schools, affecting especially the SC, ST, and Muslim communities. In Pakistan, for example, the report of the Working Group on Universal Periodic Review found that the lower caste Hindus, officially known as Scheduled Caste Dalits, were exposed to caste-based discrimination. The group noted the absence of specific laws and measures prohibiting discrimination against the scheduled castes. In Nepal, the Durban Review Conference Follow-up Committee found, among others, that the Madheshi Dalits have been denied their right to acquire citizenship. Despite recommendation 17 of the CERD pressing for due recommendations at all levels, I'm going to go over that again. Despite recommendation 17 of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination 2004 pressing for due representation at all levels in the government, legislative bodies, judiciary and other decision-making bodies, the government of Nepal has failed to implement these recommendations. Despite recommendation 32 of the Committee of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1998 and the constitutional mandates, the state has failed to make special provisions for Dalits and no adequate policy has been developed or implemented in this regard. No provisions have been made to assimilate and compensate the Haliyas, a community of landless bonded labor. No policies or strategies are in place to eliminate discrimination against Badi women who are doubly discriminated based on gender and caste. Dalit children face caste-based discrimination and untouchability in schools, temples and other public places. Stricken by poverty, they are exploited sexually and economically as child labor. Now, what we call is a need for immediate action. The following recent cases of untouchability and caste discrimination reported in Indian and Nepalese news media act as reminders of the gravity of the problem and reflect an urgency behind the need for social and economic upliftment and empowerment of Dalit communities. Women belonging to the Badi community in Nepal are treated as most untouchable of untouchables and have been threatened with destruction of their homes if they continue to live within the village within the village limits. Socially ostracized, these women are forced to live in utter poverty and resort to prostitution for a living. In a similar case of flagrant violation of human rights, Dalits in the city of Puri in India were punished for entering the temple of goddess Kali. A sign was posted defining the exact area within which Dalits are allowed to be present near the temple premises. Such violations call for strong international condemnation and action on the part of concerned states to honor their international human rights obligations and take immediate steps to prevent their occurrence and bring the perpetrators to justice. The ICDR holds a strong conviction that UN is an effective forum to promote meaningful dialogue between Dalit communities and concerned state parties. It can act as a catalyst in promoting Dalit rights universally. Given the flagrant violations of Dalit human rights and escalation in exploitative social and economic conditions, the UN is a beacon of hope and can be instrumental in restoring dignity and empowering exploited Dalit communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have a formal statement?
I have a very brief formal statement on behalf of the African Canadian Legal Clinic. So just to sort of give a bit of history about the clinic, it was established in 1994 to address issues of anti-Black racism within the province of Ontario, but also on a national scale. And the way we take sort of a multi-pronged approach to this issue, both in terms of representing litigants in human rights complaints using the human rights mechanisms of in the province and in the nation, as well as intervening in cases that we believe will have an impact on the African Canadian community, monitoring legislation, meeting with ministers at various levels of government to address concerns with respect to the impact that certain pieces of legislation will have on the African Canadian community, and also engaging on an international scale. So representatives of the African Canadian Legal Clinic were present in Durban in 2001 and Geneva in 2009 and New York today. So this document is very important to the clinic and the community which we represent. So this is a very brief statement from the African Canadian Legal Clinic. The African Canadian Legal Clinic affirms its commitment to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Anti-Black racism is a reality in Canada, and anti-Black racism continues to be the fundamental barrier to equality for African Canadians. African Canadians struggle against color-coded economic disparity, criminalization, and racial profiling. This reality exists despite Canada's laws, our charter, and our provincial and federal human rights legislation that are meant to protect racialized people. A large part of this is because of how deeply anti-Black racism is embedded in the fabric of Canadian society. It is systemic and institutionalized. More than enough studies have been done in Canada to make it clear that African Canadians are one of the most marginalized and disadvantaged peoples in Canada. Along with Indigenous people, we are the poorest of the poor. We are incarcerated at alarmingly high rates. We experience high unemployment rates. Our youth experience high dropout and push-out rates from educational systems, and we receive the poorest health care. African descendants throughout the Americas experience the same manifestations of anti-Black racism, whether we are in Latin America, the Caribbean, or North America. For example, not only do African Canadians experience extreme poverty, they are also disproportionately represented amongst the poor. Poverty among African Canadians is more than 3 times the average for that of white Canadians, and 2 times more when compared to the general population, including other racialized groups. 40% of African Canadians live in poverty, compared to only 10% for white Canadians. Even among other racialized groups, African Canadians fare the worst. No other racialized group has more than 30% living below the poverty line, except for African Canadians and Indigenous peoples. Poverty is an indicator of racism, and we support the call for a racial equality index for the Americas. This would include the collection of disaggregated race-based data for the purpose of measuring the extent of the racialization of poverty and any progress for African descendants in the Americas. Another serious concern has been the rollback of protection for victims of racial and other forms of discrimination in Canada. We are starting to see legislation that decimates our provincial human rights commissions, which are human rights enforcement agencies. This legislation will detrimentally impact on the ability of African Canadians, the disabled, the poor, women, and other racialized groups to access justice and protection from discrimination. Though it appears the Canadian government does not care enough about these fundamental and color-coded human rights issues, the African Canadian Legal Clinic is here to demand these rights be truly respected and promoted. Racial inequalities in Canada are on the rise, and as economic conditions continue to deteriorate, members of the African Canadian community will continue to be disproportionately affected by racism. Within this context, it is critical that Canada embrace this process and be a part of it. We share with the international community our tremendous disappointment with our Canadian government's withdrawal from this important and critical international conference. We consider the Canadian government's shameful withdrawal as a failure to conform to its UN obligations. The outcome of this conference is of great significance to Afro-descendant and Aboriginal peoples in Canada and around the world. We urge the United Nations to set the conditions to combat racism high. The circumstances and time that has already passed requires a high standard.
Thank you, Moya. I think it was really the two of you who had formal statements to make, so I thank you both for that. And I don't know if you have extra copies of that that could be shared with people here. We have be with us for an hour, and I'd like to take an opportunity for her to talk about the role that she's playing here, about the foundation as well. One of the important things, perhaps it is the single most important thing for people of African descent with regard to the Durban Declaration, is that it declared the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. This really underscores the remarks that Moya has made. And I'd like to use that as a springboard for you to talk a bit about the foundation, why it was started, and any work that it's done in regard to.
Well, okay, but it was not my goal. My interrogation, because we are here for the DDPA, it was to see how is it possible now to have a lot of things regarding the international law for fight against racism, xenophobia, and even a lot of violations as for Dalit, as for the Afro-descendants, and also asking for reparation for the victim of slavery, trade slavery, but also victim of new form of slavery, but also victim, as the Palestinian people are victim for not being in their own state as they are claiming since 63 years. We have all the instruments now. We have the Declaration for Self-Determination, for end the colonialism, for end the racism, and even we have a DDPA. It's too much because all these instruments are violated by the government, by the state, by some people, but mostly by the state. And I try to see how they do that, and how they are on the way to do that, because we are here claiming our rights and saying, stop, please stop, don't do that. Écoutez.
To listen.
Listen. Okay, thank you. Listen our voice, listen what our demands. It's like you said, I was in India last 3 weeks, and it was absolutely incredible for me, because I know in the Indian law the discrimination against Dalit is forbidden. Yes. It is forbidden. Yes. But when you see on the road in the city the Dalit, you can recognize them. They are suffering. And this suffering, you can see the suffering on your body, on their body. And they are so different from the other Indians. You can see, you can know this person is Dalit. Yes. And it's incredible. We are in 21st century. How is it possible to blame the people because they are from so-called inferior caste? How is it possible? And we know exactly why they are doing that. They are doing that because they are afraid. Now they are afraid with the the systemic crisis, economic or financial crisis. They are afraid to lose their power, and they use the international instrument as a rule for them, but they don't read from as we ask to them to read, but they make the contrary. They make exactly the contrary, and they are doing a double game and double language, because here they say, okay, against racism, no. Okay, we agree with that, of course. We want, as they said, a human family. We want that, of course, without discrimination, xenophobia, and so on. But they said that. But in their own state, by example, like in the European state, they are voting some xenophobic law against migrants. But not only against migrants, against the people coming from former immigration, as Algerian immigration, African immigration, but not the white immigration, because our country in France is built on diverse immigration. Polynesia, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and after that Algerian and African, West African, and now with a lot of people coming from different countries where there is a war. War imposed by the power, not war between states, but war imposed by the hegemony. It's absolutely different. And now they use new xenophobic law against the people from Africa if they are Muslim. If they are Muslim, therefore they are dangerous because they are terrorists. Of course, we don't have to forget 2 days after Durban in 2001. If you remember, I just came back from Durban at this time, and I just landed in Paris, and I heard, as every of you, this horrible thing. Of course, it is horrible, it is terrific, but it's not a good reason to implement such law, such behavior, which violates the international law and all instruments, and make the bed to the hegemony and to the racism, the discrimination. Now we are facing that. All of us are able to do the same analysis. And I'm sure if we discuss about the Dalit, about the Canadian migration in Canada, or Afro-descendants, and now it's very interesting because now the new victim of this liberalism is the Afro-descendant. And we share the same view on the analysis. But what can we do? What can we do? It is our own question. We could have some organization. I'm sure every of us are doing our best and locally a very good job for work with the people victim of discrimination, I'm sure. But what can we do? To do a network? Maybe, I don't know, maybe. But what can we do facing the power of hegemony? Because it is a question now. It is a question. And believe me, what will happening next Friday in this building, if the Palestinian does not obtain their state, the UN process is down. Is down because sorry, because one of the principal pillar of the UN Charter is the self-determination. The self-determination based on the non-discrimination between states. It is Article 2.4 from the Charter of the UN Charter. It is the main pillar of this building and all all the humanity. It is the main pillar. And if it's out, all the process, all the system is out. There is no more multilateral institution. It's over. And it's very grave. It is very grave. Now I have only one, as we are thinking in the Franz Fanon Foundation, we are working on that because the people working 50 years ago for end the colonialism do the same thing, did the same thing as you are doing now, in a different context. But it seems to me it's more difficult now than before. Because before, all the people under colonialism were gathered together, and they can oppose a force. They can oppose a force to the colonialism. They can oppose. Now, they said, oh, we try to oppose our force, but they said, no, we cannot do differently. Because the system is, it is a crisis, and they give us a lot of explanation, financial, for violate the system. But we have to ask to the state government to assume their responsibility, and not their responsibility, but also their obligation. They have an obligation, and one of the obligations is to respect, to protect, and to ensure the principle of non-discrimination. It is in the Charter too. It is Article 24.2. No, it's very important now to speak with them, but with some fact. You say that, but you are violating the principle of the Charter. What can you say about that? And we have to have a confrontation with this state and to say stop to rob us, stop to violate the Charter, because the Charter was doing for us, by us. We, the people of the nation. It is the first sentence of the Charter. And I think we have to go to that and to say, stop to violate the international instrument, because do that is not a good reason. The financial system is like a paravent, Alors a veil, like a veil. It's just for double game and double standard. That's all. And my idea, and one of the ideas, but it's needs more time and more thinking. If you remember, the end of colonialism was obtained with a conference, in Bandung conference, do you remember, in 1956. Why now? It was a conference between states under colonialism. But why now? Don't be claiming for a conference called Bandung, but Bandung of the people, Bandung of people, claiming for another way to lead the world, respecting the self-determination, non-discrimination for all the people and all the countries. Because one of the countries who is suffering a lot about that is not India now, it's not China, but it's Africa. It is Africa. And on the behalf of the systemic crisis, they go to Africa and they rob the natural resources, and now they sell all the country. They sell all the country for more
access to
access to resources and access to alimentation. They said alimentation. We cannot admit that. We cannot admit the African was under colonialism and now under a new form of colonialism. We cannot accept that. And everywhere where we are, even if we are working on Dalit, on Afro-descendants in Canada, on negrophobia in France, for example, like Almami, we have to contextualize our work in this context, particular context, asking for something for everybody against discrimination, xenophobia, and racism. It's for me, it's one of the way. It's not the only way, but it is one of the important way to try to enlarge our forces, because we are alone. We are very alone, and they refuse to listen us. They refuse to listen us. As expert, I was in Geneva, and I make a statement at the last UN Human Rights Council, and of course, I spoke about the French situation. It's very easy for me. I am from here, and it was my first intervention. I cannot speak about all the Afro-descendant problem everywhere in the world. I focus just on the French situation. And the French ambassador, representative, was there, and he came after, and he told me, but you don't have to do that. You have an expert, you know, you don't have to denounce the situation in France. I said, but I am free. As expert, I am free. If you don't know what I have to do as expert, I can send you. But I'm free. I'm free. Speaking. I have the free speech. I have that, and you cannot tell me if you are not. If you don't agree with me, we can share and we can discuss. But you cannot refuse to me to speak and to say what I have to say, because it is a reality. You cannot mask. Everybody knows that. They were speaking about the people from Romania, very badly treated in France. And he said something absolutely, it was a lie. It was a lie. And that's the reason they are using the double standard and the double language. We have to point them and to say, no, now you are lying. You can do differently. You can do. See what the organization from the ground are doing with some alternative. We can do differently. Stop to lie.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I have a question, please?
Please, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I just wanted to sort of clarify one of your points with regards to the bid, Palestine's bid for statehood. Is it your position that the bid for statehood is important for oppressed people, not merely because Palestinians are victims of racism, but because the very legitimacy of the United Nations hangs in the balance, and it's important for, African nations and Afro-descendants and other minorities and oppressed people, because you have faith in the United Nations as a mechanism for us to address our issues.
Self-determination, was on the main pillar of the UN Charter. And if you say this population cannot access to the state because there is a relation of power, it's just a relation of power. It's nothing else. A relation of power is not in favor of the Palestinian because of history. But we don't have to forget how was created Israel. And when they need to violate the system, they did. It is exactly what they did for the creation of Israel. It was a vote, and the vote, it is a long story, but it is another story. But now it's there. Okay, it's there. But the Palestinians have the right to have self-determination since 63 years. And there is no arguments against that. No argument, except relation of power. And now, as the UN is more or less in a bad situation, what they did in Iraq, what they did in Libya, now with the reconnaissance, it's very funny and it's incredible. They just recognize the CNT as state instead to the Libyan state, but we refuse the reconnaissance of Palestinian state. How do you think about that? There is a way for certain representative, but not another way for certain person and certain people. It's like with the Dalit. Right. It's the same thing, but at different level. And now with the Iraq, the Libya, but also with the assassination of Saddam Hussein and Bin Laden. Of course they have to be trial, but not killed as bandits, not killed like that. It's a murder. Under the name of the UN nation, we are murder. It's impossible. It is against the philosophy of the international law and the international humanitarian law. It is against. That's the reason now we are in a very bad, very grave situation. Because if they fail with that, I think all the process of UN will be down, and it's very grave.
The issues that we've been discussing the past few days really has to do with the credibility of the UN at this point, not only because of the question of Palestinian statehood, but because of also the Durban Declaration. I'm a curator by training, so I take my cues of just looking at graphics, looking at visuals. All of the pre-cons, the conference itself, Geneva, there was a logo attached to it. Go online, and I dare you to find a logo for the commemoration process. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. So even that small gesture lets us know that in the eyes of the UN, this is really something that they'd really rather not deal with. It's not even important enough to mark in any way. And part of what we're here to do is, and what this process has been about, is about marking our territory in a manner of speaking. And in some cases, quite literally in the case of Palestine. Because I know you don't have a great deal of time.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I think it's important that we do talk about something very specific, and it's sensitive, it's naughty, but one of the things that this conference has been labeled as is it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Zionist, it's anti-racist, it's anti-Jewish, it's against Israel and everything that Israel stands for. Or it's against Jews and everything that Jews stand for. I don't like to use the word anti-Semitic because Semites are Arabs and they're Jews. So, and then the question of is Zionism, racism, I don't want to get into that polemic either. But I haven't seen the millions that were threatened to be outside boycotting this event. But I think it's something that we do have to talk about in terms of why a particular sector of the world community has come out against the Durban Review and its affiliated processes. But I'm more concerned about how do we use the weapons, the very carefully crafted, very well organized, very well funded weapons and tools that those who are against Durban, how do we use it not so much against them, as much as how do we take some of the things that they've done, which have been extremely effective, even if it's contrary to our beliefs. But how do we borrow from their best practices to sort of usurp the process and take control and take this process to where we want it to go, where it needs to be?
So I think you and Marie made a very important point that about the credibility of the UN being imbalanced. The truth is that I think there is a concerted effort to undermine the credibility of the UN, and that the World Conference Against Racism was just a convenient excuse. Why? Because victims of racism in the world today have no power. So it was a convenient excuse to undermine the credibility of the UN, which is why a small segment of pro-Israeli groups have been able to get so many countries to back out of something that you would think impossible given the amount of organizing we have in the different countries. In the United States, we have an active racial justice movement. You would have thought it impossible that under our first African American president that we would refuse to participate in a Durban, in a world conference, a world discussion about racism.
With the third largest Afro-descendant community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. But the truth, and the unfortunate truth, which speaks to your initial question, is that we don't have the kind of power that we need to affect decision makers. Our politicians listen to people with power, and who has power? In this case, AIPAC has power, right? If you want to know what we've been doing over the past couple of years, since the Durban Review Conference, is teaching people about the DDPA. People don't know what's in the DDPA. That's why I start my conversations just going over what's in the DDPA. And referencing, okay, you say this is anti-Israel, let's reference the two paragraphs that specifically mention Israel. Calling for a country's right to security, is that anti-Israel? Asking the Palestinians and the Israelis to come up with a peace, to speed up peace negotiations, is that anti-Israel? Really? But nobody knows that. And then all the wealth of information that actually specifies specific actions that countries can take to address the very urgent problem of racism and racial discrimination in the world community, we ignore based on misinformation. But I think the thing is that we need to do more, I should say, educating people about what's actually in here, what this mandate is first. Because we have to disabuse people of the notion that there's anything wrong with a world discussion against racism, except from people who are reluctant to discuss racism. So the only people who, in my mind, all the countries and all the representatives who are boycotting or refusing to participate in this process are people who truly do not want to discuss or come up with solutions for racism in this country or in this world. So I really think that we need a lot more education, and we need to figure out how we can start to lobby and make life uncomfortable for our different representatives. The UN is not an inanimate object. It's a conglomeration of all our different countries. And while, yes, we may not have that much power, within our own countries, we can make life a little more difficult for people.
Right, and so one of the things that I'd very much like us to do is to articulate what are those things that we can do to make life a little bit more difficult for people. And I'd like to explore this idea further that you're still fomenting, Muriel, about essentially a band-down conference of the people. And this is the same conference I made reference to that brought together the Third World Alliance. And and we do need something similar to happen within civil society, because it's clear we have laws. There are laws all over the place. There's no political will to implement them, and it may also be that even though many of these laws are the people who determine the law, the citizens, the denizens of countries determine these laws, but it seems only a small number of them know what they are, and the rest of us don't. And we need to figure out, again, how do we make, I think, this information more accessible, more popular. And use that as an opportunity to segue to Mami and to have you talk about the brigade anti-negrophobie and l'émergence and the work that you do there.
Je vais commencer par présenter l'avancement citoyenne, donc qui a pour objectif.
He's going to start out with talking about the Black Citizens Alliance.
Donc cette association existe depuis 2005 et elle a vu le jour suite à en quelque sorte un clash qui a eu, un problème qui a eu entre un animateur télé et un comédien camerounais, français d'origine camerounaise, à l'époque de Dowoti Desir. Et nous, en tant que jeunes afro-européens, nous sommes indignés par rapport à l'attitude et la réaction et le manque de réaction de politique en France par rapport aux propos qui ont été tenus à cette époque.
The Alliance was founded in 2005. It came into existence as a result of a clash that took place between a very well-known journalist, but he's an actor as well. Actually, he's renowned as one of the most important actors in France. He's a Cameroonian, French, Dieudonné. No, but
son prénom c'est Dieudonné, son nom de famille c'est Mbalambala.
Mbalambala, oui. Dieudonné Mbalambala. I could remember it. Yes. And so the attitude and the reactions, this tension that evolved, c'était raciste. It was a racist one. It outraged the youth in particular, and so the Black Citizens Alliance emerged out of that discourse.
Et pour faire court, suite à cet événement, puisque c'était très long comme affaire, suite à cet événement, l'animateur télé a décidé d'arrêter de faire la télé après 6 mois de mobilisation devant les studios d'enregistrement de l'émission concernée.
Because of actions taken by their group, the television presenter stopped the shows. He stopped working because this ugly racist exchange took place between Dieudonné and a television host.
Et par rapport à ce que Mireille et Dowoti ont exposé tout à l'heure, notamment sur la réalité en France, à l'époque, quand on a décidé de passer à l'action, la France a voulu nous présenter comme un groupe radical.
This group has been presented as extremists, radical extremists in France.
Et c'est pour cette raison que nous avons établi comme statut de lutter contre toute forme de discrimination, en particulier la négrophobie.
One of the principal things that they are addressing and attacking is anti-negrophobia, or it would be Afrophobia. It would be the best way to translate that into English.
Et nous avons multiplié des actions jusqu'à aujourd'hui qui ont fait que nous avons créé ce qu'on appelle la brigade anti-négrophobie, qui permet à d'autres organisations qui luttent contre le racisme de créer un seul même bloc lorsqu'il y a des opérations mises en place pour dénoncer des propos xénophobes, racistes des personnalités politiques ou du showbiz ou même des actes subis par des citoyens lambda qui n'ont aucun moyen de défense face à...
One of the things that they've done is founded the anti-neighborphobia, or the anti-Afrophobic group, and it consists of different organizations that are fighting against racism, and the racism can come from official places, government, but also ordinary citizens who are acting aggressively against other citizens of France.
Et notamment l'affaire qui a fait le bruit, malheureusement, je pense que ça n'a pas fait de bruit chez vous, c'était le boycott de Guerlain.
Oh, something that happened that probably didn't make much noise here was the boycott against Guerlain. Guerlain is a very well-known, one of the oldest French, perfumeries in the world. Shalimar and there's a bunch of
Bol de Nuit,
yes, all these very, they're elegant French perfumes, but their policies are not terribly elegant. And Guerlain was renounced and boycotted against for not hiring.
Alors, un journal télévisé, la journaliste lui a posé une question sur la création de son nouveau parfum. Et il a émis le fait que
les nègres sont fainéants.
En gros, sa phrase voulait dire que les nègres sont fainéants, même si j'ai travaillé comme un nègre, le nègre ne pourra jamais produire ce que je produis en travaillant.
Ah, mais il a bien employé le mot nègre à la télé.
Right. It's essentially, a representative of Guerlain said words to the effect of, I could work as hard as a nigger, but a nigger could never do the work that I do. That's basically what was said, and it was still television.
Yes.
It was televised. It was televised. And this happened in the past year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In the past
1 year. 1 year.
Yeah.
Yes, I think. Yes,
Yeah. And so there were demonstrations. Again, it's. I'm just trying to think. Perfumes are not as big a deal here, but imagine if McDonald's made a comment like that. It's.
Et les pressions que nous avons mis en boycottant la Galerie Lafayette, je ne sais pas quel est l'équivalent aussi.
Macy's.
Voilà. On a plus ou moins boycotté un Macy's.
They boycotted the store, the equivalent of Macy's.
Et ce qui a abouti à des discussions, des tables rondes avec le groupe LVMH, puisque ça appartient au groupe LVMH, Berlin. Et ce qui nous a permis de mettre en place, par exemple, l'aboutissement du financement des recherches concernant la drépanocytose. Cette maladie rare qui touche une majorité de Noirs et de Maghrébins aussi, mais plus...
Among the things that they did were to organize a series of dialogues and roundtables with LVMH, which is a luxury group, conglomerate, to discuss not only this matter but the issue of racism in general, as it's manifest in marketing practices, in hiring practices, as well as the kind of statements that were made.
Et la dernière action, on a été rejeté de la commémoration du dîner d'esclavage sur Paris.
Yes.
C'est parce qu'on portait ces t-shirts.
In May, on May 10th, which is the international, the National Day of Recognizing the Transatlantic Slave Trade in France, Sarkozy actually had an official, it's a big official thing. The brigade showed up wearing these t-shirts, demonstrating against them. And they were harassed, people were arrested, it was all over the French national television for wearing the t-shirts, for showing up, because this was supposed to be very sacred, very somber, sacrosanct ceremony, but they showed up in these T-shirts.
On s'est fait éjecter malgré.
They were ejected.
Nos invitations.
And they were actually invited. You had to have a formal invitation from the French government, from the president's office. So they had their invitations, but they showed up with these T-shirts. And then they were unceremoniously escorted out.
Et ça confirme ce que Mireille expliquait tout à l'heure, l'hypocrisie du gouvernement français par rapport à la réalité des Noirs, du traitement de la question noire, donc le racisme qui subit les Noirs en France.
So this is an example that underscores the remarks that Mireille has made about the hypocrisy of France, that there are laws that are in place there, and yet this sort of day-to-day systemic manifestation of racism and xenophobia.
Je voulais enchaîner ensuite sur ce qu'elle expliquait tout à l'heure.
She wants to address something.
Sur effectivement, vous l'avez souligné aussi, c'est qu'on a tout ce qu'il faut, on a tous les outils.
We have all the tools, all the instruments that we need.
Et quelle pourrait être la meilleure transition pour créer, on va dire en quelque sorte, cette convergence des forces et cette unité internationale pour lutter contre ce racisme qui nous fait encore du mal, puisqu'on a, comme elle a dit, on n'a pas encore le pouvoir de le défendre auprès des institutions. Au fil de mon évolution de militant, j'ai fini par créer un mouvement politique indépendant des grands partis.
Because we don't have the kind of political power that you spoke of, that he felt it's important that, given all the tools and resources we do have at our disposal, that we consolidate these things and bring them together. And one of the things that Al-Mami has done is he's actually founded a political party that is, this is the Emergence.
Ça, c'est les deux affiches de la campagne de 2010 par des régionales.
So it's an independent political party that actually addresses the issues that we are concerned with. And so that is something that's being thrown out on the table as something that we should consider doing. I want to welcome Edgardo A, who is, among other things, international well-known leader in Latin America. He has also done a lot of work on health disparities and was one of the original Durban 400, even though there weren't 400 people there. But he played an instrumental role in facilitating the process. So, welcome. So we're just having a conversation about what our organizations are doing, key things that we feel we have to move on, and Amami was just talking about his group. Some of the things that have come up is, again, the fact that we do have tools at our disposal, and so how do we make the most effective use of those tools? One of the things that Mireille talked about was creating another kind of Bandung conference of the people, and we also talk about the reaffirming the DDPA, the Indigenous Peoples. We talk about the Indigenous Peoples Forum in the African descendant community. We talked about creating an Afro-descendant, a permanent forum for Afro-descendants, and as you were talking, I was thinking about the Dalit community and to what extent that such a forum a discussion of such a forum has come up amongst your ranks, or is there a way of marrying sensibilities that are already very, very closely aligned? In fact, there are great historical alliances that we realize between movements in the Dalit community dating back as far as the 18th century, and the the resistance movements or the emancipation movements here in the U.S. So I'd like for us to talk about that a bit, because we do have issues of criminalizing our cultures. There are laws there to protect us, and then there are the laws there to further criminalize what we do. So how do we negotiate these things? What are some of the concrete things that, steps that we can take to move things forward? I know there are a number of things that have come up over the past 4 years, and including, as I mentioned earlier, the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. But is there a broader coalition that could be created, a permanent forum for people of color in general? We know that funding needs to be provided for these activities in such a forum. Again, disaggregated information is something that has been brought up, and I know something that Edgardo and a group of people that he's worked with has talked about creating a decade for people of African descent. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well when you speak, Edgardo. But we know we have to turn this into a popular document. The UN had 10 years to do that. It didn't do so. So how do we do that? In Brazil, we can talk about that. I know this book has been used as a tool for education in schools. So there are different organizations, there are different states, there are different agencies, different members of civil society who have taken it upon themselves to really make this a more effective instrument for change. Maybe we can talk about some of those things concretely, and figure out a way to make it a bigger, more collective, a more organized practice amongst ourselves.
Dalits themselves are really divided, on a number of issues. So there needs to be a lot of solidarity, and the DDPA, I think, is probably the only international instrument which has really recognized the cause of the untouchables. And so we have to make concerted efforts to form a strong networking, an international networking with all the stakeholders that are working, to have the DDPA implemented. We are a little disappointed because some of the Dalit organizations, including us, have not been invited to tomorrow's meeting. And none.
You applied?
Yes, I think
Ours, but there were many other Dalit organizations that actually had long-standing relationships and actually long-standing experiences with participating in high-level meetings that were turned away at the last minute.
So it's just a little because we look at the United Nations as the appropriate forum to voice democratic concerns, and if you're not included, it again goes back to the question of credibility of the UN itself, and I think unity is a very important factor here when we're discussing issues related to caste, race, and similar lines of discrimination. We need to stand unified and kind of form, I think, a kind of a political bloc, so to speak, that can really have a very strong say in the appropriate places of power. I'll let the others to take it from there. But
I want to underscore that point, that we need to be unified, because I worry that sometimes that those of us fighting for racial justice and human rights have lost sight of what we're fighting for. Because that's the only explanation I can find for why we don't work together more, even in plannings around the Durban Review. At 10 years, we're still fighting each other. So it's just, I really think that if we're going to make any progress, we have to be clear about what we're fighting for and stand unified and be able to let go of some of the usually not substantive disagreements that we have. A lot of the disagreements we have are not on substance or principle. It's more personality, if you will.
Right, I agree. Yeah.
So I think that it's imperative that we be unified. So I just want to underscore that point.
Do you feel part of it is because, again, that this process has become NGOized in some ways, that it's no longer a social movement, or people are not treating it as a social movement? Some might argue that the UN's credibility has been sinking for quite some time, and now it's really on the precipice of sort of falling over that edge. So if it goes, it goes. But we're still here, and our problems are still going to be there tomorrow. If we think of this along the lines of a social movement, what do we have to do? What can we do to create political will amongst ourselves, the solidarity that we've talked about, to take things forward? Because there are the official stories, there are official ways of doing things, there are the sanctioned ways of doing things, and then there are the other ways of doing them. So if we can focus some of our discussion on some of those other ways.
Well, one of the, when you talk about if the UN is no longer legitimate, and increasingly as states themselves have so many challenges that they become delegitimized, particularly for oppressed people, the institutions that strike me as playing a larger-than-life role, and in fact are across all of our borders, are multinational institutions, and I think it's and multinational companies. And so I wonder if I strongly agree with the point around the need for greater unity and ideally need for greater communication across language and across countries, but to lift up challenges that occur. I wish I knew more about the case in France on the perfume company, but because those are companies that are also here in the United States, that are also sell products in India and in other countries, and wonder whether or not the surprising solidarity of other racial minority groups in other countries that also choose to do even small-scale but vocal boycotts quite suddenly, quite quickly, in a surprising way, might, I think, have some result and potentially draw attention in a way that it doesn't fully draw in a single country. So I know that as someone who is American, but cares deeply and works deeply on issues around caste in India, it is particularly interesting to think about how we might think about the strength that communities have economically, even when we don't yet have the political strength we may need to get access to make the changes that are so drastically needed.
I guess it's not surprising, but hearing you speak about the issues facing the Dalits, there were certain things, and this has been something that's come up in previous sessions in the past couple of days, where if we're talking about building a united front, we need to focus on our commonalities as opposed to our trivial differences, and trivial including sort of, well, I represent this community and you represent that community, and therefore we're different, and we're going to take a crabs in a bucket approach, and I want to get to the top, and I don't care about you. So, but in terms of how do we go about building that struggle, it's about focusing on our commonalities, because our communities are different, but you raised issues of citizenship, you raised issues of education, you raised issues of criminality, of employment, of property rights, of the intersectionality of gender and race. And these are all things that it doesn't matter what sort of group you represent, they are across the board. And so I think this is difficult. It is going to be difficult in terms of prioritizing these issues and saying, okay, we represent oppressed people around the world. We have different organizations. We've come together now. We have Canada, the US, we have India, we have France sitting at this table. That's a good start. You know? Oh, sorry.
And actually Haiti too.
Yeah, okay. You know? That's a good start. I think the difficult part of that is going to be, we all face these issues. Let's pick something that we're going to devote all of our attention to and move forward on this particular issue for the next 2 years. And see, you know, something like that, like a very directed and focused energy on one particular issue. And something that's come up, and I realize that I'm speaking from a sort of a particular perspective because of where I come from and the community that I represent, but I feel like it was something that had come up, that Nuala had brought up also, where she it basically was talking about calling out our governments. And actually, yeah, it's something that the Dalit community can relate to as well, where you have our government appearing before international bodies and saying, well, we've implemented this law, and we now have taken this off of the books, and we now have done this, and then saying, okay, but the reality of what is actually happening on the streets and what is actually the change that has actually been produced is minimal. But what we need to do is to be able to back up those allegations. And so in everything that the African Canadian Legal Clinic does, we always ask for disaggregated data, because in a lot of cases, they have the data. They don't want to release it. The corrections, education systems, they all know the effect that their laws is and is not having. And you know, we need to, I think, maybe make a concerted international effort and say, we know you're collecting the data, we want it, and then we're going to shame you in front of the world and say, yeah, you've created these laws, they're not working, you know? And so I think maybe a very focused, directed energy on a particular issue, and another part of what I was thinking, and maybe this is an idealist and you know, very young perspective to take, but I mean, particularly for the Afro-descendant community, we have roots in nations who, like you had said, the United Nations is a conglomerate of nations. And individually and maybe economically, there isn't a lot of power, but you know, it's still what, you know, well, it's an entire continent of nations that we can call on and say, look what is happening to your people in these nations, and join us in shaming them, which maybe I understand that it's a little naive because there are issues with our political structures in African nations, but it's something that we can maybe do.
As a group, they have power.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, our brothers and sisters in the African Union have not been very vocal and have not done a great deal when it comes to the DDPA. Mm-hmm. You know, and on one hand, the problem can be described from their perspective as, well, we don't have racism in our countries. You know, the issue is something else for them. The issue is probably closer to class and caste-based issues within the continent, and precisely because of the same reasons. The Dalit community is only recently gotten the world's attention, well, gotten attention on the world stage. Some of us have known about the caste system for many, many, many years, decades even. Yeah, so this is sort of a recent issue. It's talked about in here, but not as fully as it could be, as it should be. But it's my sense that in the African community, that seems to be more of a concern. It's class and caste-based. It's not so much about race. And so that has, I believe, created a set of tensions and sort of fractured the role that the African community plays, the African Union specifically plays with respect to the DDPA, even in the Caribbean. Um, my own country, Haiti, has played very little role in any of this, and yet we have one of the worst problems of xenophobia anywhere right next door with our Dominican neighbors. We talked about anti-negrophobia, there's anti-Haitianismo or anti-Haitianism in DR, which is, it's rampant and it's dangerous and it's brutal and it's savage. This is an issue that I know both sides of the borders. There was a bilateral agreement that was crafted out, but it hasn't been enforced. It hasn't been upheld. But Umberto and I can witnessed and heard conversations in other meetings where, especially in the Anglophone Caribbean, people think, oh, this is not a problem for us. There's no issues of race here. So they're not supportive. They're not fighting for the DDPA as they should be. And so I'm not sure that we really have places or nations to lean on in the way that we could. In Latin America, that is not an issue. There's a great deal of support, great deal of solidarity there, in spite of the emergence of some right-wing governments in that region. But it's my sense, and he will confirm, that there's more integration there. Here in the U.S., I think for a long time the African American community was at the helm of things, but I wouldn't argue that that's the case.
I haven't been in conversations with any delegates recently on the DDPA. I know the African nations are instrumental in informing the content. But I think maybe it's looking at what the DDPA stands for narrowly. In other words, we're not just talking about racism, racial discrimination, right, xenophobia within countries, but also globally and international relationships and the legacy of colonialism and the effect that's had on many, if not most, of the countries in the global south. And what the economic relationship should be today to compensate for that racist legacy that the global north has had with the global south. And so I think that perhaps they don't fully appreciate these days what the DDPA really stands for.
Two things. One, I think that the issue of differences, what appear as difference, is, at least in our region, we are clear that the nation state, the nation state that was constructed in the last 200 years, we call it kind of liberal, so-called democratic state, failed. And they failed because they were constructed with colonialist ideas, and we're race-defined class in our region. Because if you're part of the inferior race, there's no part you could be part of the elite. So the whole debate, I think one of the problems of analysis is that the kind of UN movement sometimes lack a serious analysis of what it is we facing, what are the challenges, and what is our vision of a different type of society. Because the problem of the application of the DDPA document is that it's questioning the foundation in which the nation state operates at this point, and how colonialism, which define economic relationship and stratification and citizenship of people, define how those citizens have rights, relate as it's Dahali people, or invisible. Because a lot of us are untouchable in our country, we just don't call it that. Yes. The majority of our people in our country are invisibilized, untouchable, and we're forgotten by these governments. So in our region, we have been forced to question the nature. I mean, a region where we have gone through everything you can invent, right? Military coup to repression. Some of us have lived in exile for differences. What I think is fundamental in this period is that at least we came up with a sense, at least in our region, that the whole concept of Eurocentrism, where your society, you try to what we call mestiçar, mix people, and that the races disappear and suddenly we emulate in Europe. So race and class and ethnicity and things doesn't matter. Like you interview Latin Americans and you ask them their race and they will tell you their nationality. Because it's not accidental, it's constructed to deny the way we were. Well, I think we're at a different level of consciousness of that today. And so if you know in Latin America, you see, for example, I think it's a good movement to look at. It's the indigenous movement, who was seen nearly invisible in our region. And the last 30 years have constructed multiple sites of struggles and been very efficient to, one, develop a political analysis of where they fit in the world, the system that doesn't understand them, and what are they proposing as an alternative society, alternative form of organizing, an alternative form of citizenship, in a way. And I think our movement, at least in our region, we're doing a lot of work strategically because we're challenging the elite who govern for just a minority. And we're saying that they're not part of the national reality. They represent international capital there. They represent their partners in the forum. To say this, it means that the whole debate about how do we propose to change and where do we see our struggle. The difference between now, for at least in our region, and 2001 is that a lot of the struggle against racism then, the World Bank, the IMF, a lot of the foundation could talk like they were allies, even though they were linked to international system that deny all humanity on the ground. But there was a discourse, at least in our region, is the World Bank, is the IMF that published the first some of the things, asked some of us to write, about what's happening in racism. In our region, things change because the whole neoliberal restructuring model collapsed. And the impoverishment, the marginalization, the criminalization of people, we created new different type of government, if in Venezuela, if in Colombia, if in those places. And now there's a kind of regional thinking that move us from just responding to the World Bank model or the IMF model and looking for models that humanize our existence. That doesn't eliminate the problem of when you racialize society, the colonial legacy, how do you find unity in that diversity, which is experienced in Europe. In Europe, you have a whole bunch of pre-colonized people demanding citizenship in London, in France, and we're the society not ready to deal with that new citizenship in a full way. And some of us, and some of the people in those countries, I've been in some of it, have not found unity in that diversity to generate question of how those societies are organized, which wasn't to include us. So I'm saying this because I think it's not an easy process. I think that we have to find a place. I want to say one other thing. What we learn in this process is that we have to understand different types of struggles, right? And I think we kind of merge things. The UN is a very specific location of struggle. And you can't mystify the UN. The UN is a body that was created after the Second World War. It's still run by the victors of the Second World War, which is the Security Council. That kind of defines what happens, including how the High Commissioner functions. And in the UN have a whole bunch of agencies. And for the longest time, people have been struggling for those agencies to represent the demands of the majority and not just what the Security Council defines as an agenda for UNIFEM or for UNDP. Those are struggles that we have to, the struggle about civil society voice in the UN is exactly to challenge the government version of what the countries are and what have happened. But over the last 10 years, there has been an attempt to push those voices out. Beijing, the environmental movement, the Copenhagen Conference fought to bring the citizen voices to say, what you're saying is not actually what is happening. This is our reality. The government is a government body. It continues to find ways to censor. And they use 9/11, they use all kind of, but I think the indigenous people is a good example of a model we can follow. That's why we're proposing what we're proposing. The indigenous people realized that they had to have a permanent voice to challenge every government, every agency that are talking about development and citizenship without including them. The permanent forum allows you to participate in making sure that every topic, every discussion, every conference, every seminar address the issues of the different groups that are excluded. It also allows you to start forcing your government to deal with those populations when they come in and do reports. Like we're talking, even today, most of the government in Latin America do not have disaggregated data. But you know why they don't have it? Because that disaggregated data says something. Where poverty resides, who are poor, the gender part, who are educated. And that removes the whole issue about democracy from this abstraction. So I think one of the things what we're missing is to do like the indigenous people did in many ways. They have their struggle on the ground, very serious. In Latin America, they are a political force that define, and they even question the issue of nation state in ways, okay, they say, there's one state, but there's many nations. They consider themselves a nation, and they also question a lot of the national identity, one religion, one group, one culture. So we're multicultural, in Latin America, a lot of indigenous people don't even speak Spanish. In Guatemala, so there's a questioning of the nation state the way we know it. And the second thing that they're doing is confronting some of the nation state in international spaces. And the UN is one of those spaces. But it took 20 years. They have a division of labor that is excellent, that we don't develop in over. They have lawyers, they have human rights team that spend their time focusing on these institutions. That's how they achieve the indigenous people rights. It took them 15 years. People say, why they need a human rights special thing for the indigenous people? Because they're located in a special situation, and a lot of the country resisted, including some African countries, because the issue of minority rights, of ethnic rights challenge and create problems in some of the nations in Africa, where ethnicity is used and groups are used in relation to power and consolidation. So the issues are not simple, they're complex. But I think we, out of that experience, what we have to vision ourselves doing is what some of us come, is finding unity in our diversity, and at least at the UN, demanding that the voices of those people who are excluded must be there. And that civil society, and that's where we can unify. The voice, we don't have to have one organization. What we can have is make sure, that's what happened with the Dalit in the way to Durban. None of us knew anything about the Dalit. And I remember when we went to a lot of the organizing, the process towards Durban, the Dalit people were consistent. They came, they met, they presented some of the issues, even some of the division. And people said, in principle, we're going to support the Dalit people voice against the Indian government that did everything possible to bribe, to divide, to promote conflict. And all those things were the Sudan crisis was in the middle of it. So one thing, when we present these things, you bring the national crisis at the international level. And that's what we face a lot of, backtrack in it. Fighting racism in previous colonialized countries is not an easy thing. Because you're not talking about, and I tell people when they talk about racism, be careful when they say that it's kind of a single issue. Wherever racism, like in this country, race defines everything. Where you're located, your class, your possibility of stratification. If you don't understand race and the complexity, gender, you're genderized racially, and you're racialized gender-wise. How do you understand that? Because at the end what we're looking for is changing the relationship of power. How do we change the relationship where the resources of our countries, where the wealth that exists, because a lot of us don't live in poor country. We're a rich country, we have a lot of poor people and a small corrupt elite. How do we generate new proposal of what democracy really is? How do we want those societies to organize? How do you guarantee that the citizens that are there feel that their interest is on the table and is respected, and that that doesn't happen by agreement. It happened by social movement, it happened by political pressure, and those things reflect themselves there. Anyway, I just saw Obama President's speech about the progress. And it's interesting the country they choose to show the democracy. All countries in Africa that they support the changes, where the changes have already happened, there's not one word about the countries where we're getting hell in our region that needs to be addressed. Nothing about Colombia, nothing about the repression in Honduras, nothing about other places. So we have to be clear what it is we're talking about. And I think the sad thing about the DDP is that after Durban, that document stopped getting used as an instrument of consciousness, a document of organizing, and they have silenced the document. I think we need to use it. And it's going to take a while, but we need to use it to again educate people as an instrument of mobilizing. And it's no longer, and we also realize that it's a real thing. There are professional people in NGO world that live from this type of stuff, where these are people get invited, these are people who are people are consultation, and what we saw happen after Durban is that all that professionalization, when the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the other people say, we're not funding, everybody stopped going to the event. There were no more fights to see how Durban moved forward. So we understand that if we don't have autonomy and we don't invest in making this issue a reality, it's not going to happen.
Talk about concretely some of these social pressures that we can put onto our governments that we can assert, because we do have the indigenous model, we do have the Dalit model, and we even have the model of the anti-Durban people. Because even they, I mean, one thing that keeps going through my mind is the Anti-Defamation League. They have disaggregated information. We do that independent of governments. So until we can get our governments to do that, how do we organize, how do we mobilize ourselves to do the same? Before the indigenous people had their forum and got funded, there were steps that they took, and it was a long struggle before they got there. So what do we need to do? Where are we in the process of creating a similar forum for African descendants?
Well, I think we made a mistake for a review conference.
Yeah.
One of the things we were trying to do from Latin America was hard. Civil society did not do their own review of what happened in their country in the 5 years or the 10 years. The Dalit people, the Afro-descendant people, the indigenous people, we have to make a one analysis of the failure in our country to address the things about our participation. Because that gives you, like the disaggregated data. We have to produce in which countries are not doing it and demand that they comply with the agreement that they signed. Now, it's not only this agreement. Every document in the UN identifies that you have to know your population, so who they are, where they're located. So I think those are kind of stuff, but I think a common agenda is the one about, at least for the Afro-descendant and some of the other people, is a decade. For us, the decade is one thing, and a decade not because it's symbolic. Is most of the movement in UN, a decade means that you can do a plan of action and organize, and during those 10 years, everything that happened in the UN, you can demand a space to present your issue.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I think that actually these kinds of fora are a good first step, because we get to learn about each other's issues, meet each other. I think it's a fantastic idea, creating a political party of friends. And so it inspires new ideas in us. So I think that actually this is one of the first steps that we take. It is complicated. It'll be a long struggle, and we just have to stay determined. Fight the good fight.
To Umberto's comments about we need to create the data, that is why for us the Caste Freedom Index is actually one of the key research, really the first major research project that we're embarking on, looking at discrimination and information about atrocities that, frankly, that state governments are ignoring and refuse to look at, refuse to share, and are putting forward numbers about the challenge, the discrimination and atrocities happening that are completely false when compared with the reports that are coming to NGOs throughout South Asia. And Vanishri can say much more about this. But I would also say I think there's great importance to, as well as building unity among activists and adult leaders, that we make sure that young adults, teenagers are educated about this, about DDPA, about the process that you know, as you call this, the Orange Bible is brought, you know, the key pieces are brought to ways that are interesting to teenagers, you know, who speak many languages and can connect with, and that we also, of course, think about what are creative ways to use social media to connect young adults from around the world who will not meet face to face easily, many of whom do not fly on airplanes to come to international events, and just that we continue to think creatively about how new and social media can help connect young adults around these issues in ways that are empowering, creative, fun, and you know, but also have the greater message of making sure that we're learning from each other and that we're sharing each other's triumphs and struggles as well.
Vanishri, I'd like for you to talk more about the Caste Freedom Index. Is there a link that we can go to, or I don't know if you have a copy of it, because it sounds like it's a really important tool, a very effective tool that can be used and modified and applied elsewhere.
Basically, what the Caste Freedom Index proposes to do is to have a scientific data system. When it comes to caste, it's always colored with emotions. You know, a lot of numbers are cooked up, and there are a lot of there are so many things at stake when it comes to caste, especially in the Indian subcontinent. So when you're receiving information, you don't know whether you can rely on the information. Sometimes it's all blown up out of proportions. What we want to do with the Caste Freedom Index is to create a scientific tool using the expertise of sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and legal experts, so they can talk about, let's say, a case of discrimination, a case of atrocities, and you kind of identify a case, and then you talk about what are the various ways of going about it. In terms of number, identifying the numbers itself and identifying the recourse that is available, the legal recourse or other kinds of recourses, medical or psychological, as the person or the victim may be requiring. So these kind of tools, all of them coming together, that are scientific and verifiable. So you know that when you go there, it is all consolidated, it's in one place. First of all, it offers comprehensive information and advocacy tools to shape policies that face caste-based discrimination. It tries to enumerate and evaluate atrocities, and that's also very important because you need to evaluate the kind of atrocities Dalit women face, gender-based atrocities. They're discriminated on the basis of caste. There's several ways. In fact, yesterday I was watching a very moving video. It was on YouTube. I don't remember the source, the person though who's created it. It was talking about how a high caste person had employed these Dalit untouchable people to clean the bathrooms, and all the animals and the excretion of the animals and humans together. And the man said that these people are so low down in the scale that they can't be even compared to animals. He said if his calf was to die, he would regret more. He would be very, very, very sad than if a Dalit laborer dies. Because he says, I can always replace another Dalit laborer, but my calf, my dear calf, is dead, and I'm going to regret it. It's a big thing for me. So that kind of behavior. So what we want to also do is to establish broad, reliable measures of progress in the elimination of caste-based discrimination, and try to empower grassroots movements. Try to empower them with these kind of tools where they can access information, where to find information about, let's say, the affirmative action policies available to them, and that kind of information which is reliable, and you can use that in order to make use of the opportunities that's available to you. How we propose to establish this objective database is through internal government measures. Whatever the local police, the state, or the nation's own statistics, we want to compare it with what other private organizations, other stakeholders like the NGOs and international human rights bodies are producing. So you want to see all these different various yardsticks that they are using, and you want to compare them, and you want to come up with one consolidated data. That's the kind of proposal.
Well, who funded this?
This, I think, is
voluntary?
The Nepal government. Nepal government is encouraging this.
Let me welcome Esmeralda Brown, who is our partner in this. She's with the Southern Diaspora Resources and Development Center, and very kindly and generously made the space available to us.
I want to welcome you to the Church Center for the UN, because besides working with the Southern Diaspora Resource and Development Center, I head the office here for the United Methodist Office at the UN. And what we try to do throughout the years is to facilitate the participation of NGOs from all over the world. Particularly, I try to make sure that we have the voices not only here but at the United Nations. We have done it through Sustainable Development, the Conference on Racism, and many other, the Commission on the Status of Women, and so forth. I think that this process that is taking place right now this week is extremely important. Right now, the head of states are at the UN, everyone making their statements. We as civil society, NGOs, also not only making statements, but we also need to share our experiences. And 10 years now, we want to see what the next 10 years is going to be like. As people of African descent, we are saying, and Latin America makes it very clear, and the Caribbean, that we should look towards now a decade. This has been the year. But we need to have a decade, and besides a decade, we need to have a forum also as the indigenous people on a permanent forum. So this is an opportunity for us to also, as civil society, to be able to share among ourselves and work towards those goals, and maybe take that recommendation to the UN bodies and governments. They must hear what that aspiration is. The indigenous peoples, they already have their forum, but they also want to see implementation as we also want to see it. So I want to once again welcome you. You're always welcome here. And I think that this process, I'm very happy that I'm hearing in the case of the, your people, because in Geneva, I have participated 30 years ago with the community there, and they shared their experiences, and they received solidarity within the context of a women's organization that we held with the World Council of Churches. So I'm very happy that it's being highlighted again. We always need to do this. One day, hopefully, we all will be free of the racism that we face in all of the regions.
Pour répondre à la question sur ce qui nous reste à faire.
In response to the question of what remains to be done,
j'avais une question par rapport au modèle brésilien, parce qu'apparemment, ils utilisent le modèle de Durban pour...
Quel président?
Non, au Brésil. Pour le
Oh, in
Brésil.
Brazil. There's a question about the Brazilian government.
Et je voulais en savoir un peu plus quelle était la méthode qu'il utilisait en fait pour communiquer avec la Bible des jardins.
Roberta, I'm actually going to ask you to respond to this. The question is, I mentioned Brazil making very effective use of the DDPA and integrated some of the mechanisms proposed into educational policy and things like that. So he wanted to know, Mami wants to know more about how that was done, how it unfolded its success.
The DDPA, the struggle that we're facing, is a struggle that people have to confront in their region and in their countries. It's not that you come to the UN and it's not an event. It should reflect, because these things are real on the ground. And that the first thing I think we fail was to do, or are still fail, that the weakness of people movement at home is reflected in the weakness of what comes to the UN. Because if you don't have force on the ground, you don't have no power in your country, you don't have no political, social movement in your country, your government is going to speak in behalf of who they represent. So Brazil, back to Brazil, Brazil is a very good experience in that. Brazil have a very progressive government, the Lula, President National Lula, and the PT, the PT, the Party of the Workers, is a part of a coalition of forces that brought that government to power, which include the African descendant, the indigenous movement, the landless people. How do you implement it? How does it become national policies? How does it impact organizing the society, your budget, your educational program, your health program? So what they did in Brazil, and this was struggle, they created a ministry, a special ministry named CEPIR. It's a special super ministry to address the issue of race equity. And that ministry developed policies to work with all the other ministries, health, education, to see how you implemented policies that address the legacy of slavery and colonialism that put the black Brazilians in the worst of the condition. Brazil is a very racist society. You have a majority of the black population, but very little representation in any of the power structure, including in any of the major profession or universities. So this was, and this is very important, because when you confront it, even for the Dalit people, it's not a problem that they recognize that you're there and it is superior, because it's about power. It's about who exercise and who acquire the sense of privilege and resources. That's what the debate is about. They don't mind saying that you're there if they don't have to distribute them. So in Brazil, what you have was a social movement, and it's still a big fight, who is pushing to use the document of anti-racism to decolonize and to try to democratize the institution, the state institution that's supposed to address the need of all the population, indigenous. And give an example of where you have a major fight now is in education. The Brazilian government established that there should be quota system, affirmative action with quota system in the university, because you had very little representation in any of the major professions. So what they did, they says, okay, in each of the universities, 50% of the thing needs to go to the poor in general, and 50% or more of that 50 have to be African descendant, because the last census that was done in Brazil, Afro-descendants are 52% at least of the population. If you went to Brazil 12 years ago, people were saying that was a minimum, there weren't a lot of them, because the issue of identification, and with this, also have an issue about consciousness building, about how race, in Brazil, and now we see it in Colombia, as people created campaign of education about how people were racialized, and the racism that exists, and the government took responsibility to show how the national society create all these racist categories, people start owning up to their own identity. So 10 years ago, when you do the census, less people identify African descendant, because why would I say I'm African descendant if you make me inferior? If I'm India, I'm not going to say I'm a Dali if you're going to treat me bad. It has to be a political consciousness when I take it on as a battle. So in Latin America, that's one of the big fights. How you create consciousness that we're a diverse society, that African people build this society, and that they are equal citizens. I know that people are owning up to the identity. In Brazil, the last census, there wasn't more black people were born. It was just more black people who took on ownership of the identity. The same thing is just happened in Ecuador. In Ecuador, the census was just completed, and the Afro-descendant population was largely the group who identified themselves as Afro-descendant. And that identity is not only an identity, it's not only about skin, it's about understanding the rights of equality and citizenship. And one of the slogans that we have, that we don't believe in racist democracy. If a society is racist, it's not democratic. The same thing we say, if a society, the majority of the people are poor, marginalized, it's not a democratic society. So we also are redefining what democracy is. Because we can't allow this representative democracy that is, if you have an electoral president, or the president is elected by, money, that's democracy. So that's what's happening. No, I don't want to. These are major battles. They continue to be on the ground. There's some progress, but then you have the elite who push. Like in Brazil, it's interesting. The white intellectuals, even the progressive ones, are saying that to do affirmative action for indigenous and African descendants is racializing the society, without recognizing that society is racialized already. It was organized racialized, and the people who are excluded are not demanding inclusion as a right, and that's why I think it's important that, and this is very important, that the issue of racism, we were able to position it within the human rights category. It's in there, and we have to make it be something that is sustained in that process. I would just want to end saying that I think sometimes with a discussion about gender and race, people trivialize it like it's an issue of just representation. We are talking about deconstructing an equal society and showing that the majority of the population get excluded through different category of exclusion. Women, one racial group, one ethnic group, one linguistic group. Those are tools of exclusion. Those are tools to rationalize why you're not included, why you don't have anything. We need to use those same tools to demand inclusion. So because the UN now declared that all the society are diverse, but diversity don't mean that you're equal. We've always been in diverse society. Colonialist society was diverse. The colonialists and everybody else. The question is if it's diverse and equal. The question is if that diversity produces equality and equity. So we're talking about diversity in issue of linguistic representation. In most of the society, the colonial language is imposed and all the other languages. We are fighting in Latin America religious diversity. They've been a silencing of all the African and indigenous practice. You talk about voodoo, you talk about Santeria, you talk about candomblé, and these are backward things. The indigenous people have done some very interesting. They're also fighting that their mythologies become, while we're using Greek mythology and European mythology, that the indigenous people mythology should be also part of the national identity. So it's a struggle for redefining what our societies are, who are there, and what we represent. And it's a battle that the nation states will continue to oppose because it challenges the way they're organized, and it also challenges the elite who identify themselves with the international elite. That's a very important change in our region. The elite in Latin America and in most of our country doing the independence movement, decolonization movement, had to have a national discourse they represented their people, they wanted democracy for all, the Caribbean is a very classic one. No. That elite today doesn't speak in those terms. They speak in their alliance with international capital, development, technically prepare, and so they're ready to impoverish their people for their well-being as a small group. It's not 1 to 5% where most of the wealth is concentrated in most of the world. That's a big struggle, because we are saying you can concentrate wealth in your hands. So when we present the racial stuff or the ethnic stuff or the gender stuff, we actually are presenting transformative politics in the way power is controlled. And they know it. They know that if you push that, you want to end up challenging the way power is shared and representation is shared. So I just want to bring that because I think one of the failure of using, including for the radical sector, they don't understand the value and no transformative and no visionary is the document that was produced in that process.
I want to thank all of you for being here and making this, I believe, a success. And of course, I have to give thanks once again to DDPA Watch Group's partner in this event, the Southern Diaspora Resources and Development Center. Some of the key things that came out of this discussion is the need to take back and reclaim our territories and our spaces, conceptually, legally, politically, physically, geographically, and that it's really up to us to confront our governments and hold them accountable. Yes, there are these official methods that can be used and paths that can be taken, but I think they've failed us in some ways. They're useful and they've been successful, and we have to support them and keep using them. You need to, like to say, you need to have people in the palace fighting in the palace, and you need people outside the palace fighting as well. But it's really up to us to bring about those transformative changes that have to be made. Confronting our governments, holding them accountable, are things that we've talked about, recognizing the need to build and further coalesce the alliances that have historically existed amongst us, and again, integrate room for new ones. And to look at alternative models, and to understand that we are 99%, and it's that 1% out there that is imposing their vision and their view of things upon us. And you know, it's an economic elite, it's a political elite, it's a cultural elite. But that model has to change, or otherwise this is not sustainable. We can be here, I'm having visions of myself growing old, still fighting for the DDPA. I'm having visions of my son, and whether or not at 20 years old, or 30 years old, eventually at 40 years old, or 50 years old, he's still going to be having this fight. And that may just very well be the case. So we do have to find ways of disseminating information, making it popular, making it accessible, and reminding the world that there are probably like 1 billion people on the planet that are affected by the DDPA. So it is imperative that
it's higher.
I'm saying at least 1 billion people. We know there's at least 300 million Dalits. There are how many Afro-descendants? If we just think of, yes, the African continent itself. Think about half of the world population. Actually, we're the majority here in terms of women.
Dowoti, you know what I think we didn't mention, I'm concerned, because a big issue with this economic crisis is the issue of migration and a repressive policy against poor people moving around the world just trying to live. The criminalization in Europe of immigrants is a big one. The same model has been followed here in the US against the Mexican. So we are dismantling protection in country that the state is expelling people because they can't survive, and we're creating, and that's why the document is also interesting, because we're looking about the issue of xenophobia and persecution and the criminalization of just human being moving.
But over successive generations, it becomes important because it creates stateless persons. Not just the Palestinians, but all the Haitians, for instance, who are born, Haitian descendants who are born in the Dominican Republic, who, they're not Haitians, and they're not recognized as Dominicans as well. And so, yes, the movement of people, especially poor people, from rural places, spaces into cities especially, ends up disenfranchising them, and over successive generations ends up creating another group of untouchables that way. And that's one of the important things about the Dalit community in my conversations with DB Sada. It's this expanded notion of who is a Dalit, how we all become untouchables that way, and to that end, how we use language and the renegotiation of language and its expansion so that it no longer disempowers formerly colonized people, but that we borrow concepts and constructs and languages from our various communities to further empower ourselves and dismantle processes that have never been to our advantage. So having said that, again, I look forward to more of these discussions. I'm going to pass out everybody's telephone numbers and contacts to one another so we can continue to find ways of sustaining these conversations, taking back the observations, the remarks, the recommendations of this group to each of our organizations and our communities to see how can we move forward, how do we forge forward together. Thank you again.